Hey everyone, welcome to 10-Minute Philosophy. Today I will be discussing the nature of evil, its existence in all people, and how it's rooted in the group, in hate, power, and even love. What is evil? Is it based on the morality of the majority of people within a collective group, or is it something that's inherently rooted within humans? If you're religious, you probably believe that morality is based upon the will of a divine power. Christians, for example, find the rules which make up their morality within the Bible and the Ten Commandments, which were given to Moses directly from God. Based on these rules, we can live a good life, which will be rewarded with eternal life in heaven. And if we do wrong, if we sin, if we don't live virtuously, if we commit evil acts throughout our lives, we will be punished with hell. The existence of heaven and hell are how God enforces morality. Now, other people might argue that morality is inherently rooted within humans due to evolution. People like Arthur Schopenhauer and his Will to Life might argue that morality is based upon evolutionary traits that helped early humans survive within the state of nature. Now, you take killing, for example. If you go back far enough, there may have been tribes that killed each other in cold blood, which developed mistrust, and this mistrust made them less efficient when it came to hunting, gathering, and protecting what they had. Now, other tribes that didn't kill each other in cold blood would get along better, they would live in harmony, and it would make them more efficient when it came to hunting, gathering, and fighting against other tribes. And over time, the tribes that didn't kill each other were more successful than the tribes that did, and this evolutionary trait was passed on and sort of became the mainstay of what we might consider morality. Now, I want to really go into the sort of idea that evil can be manipulated into being good based upon the morality of the majority of people within a collective group. That morality is often skewed into making ordinary people commit acts of great evil and acts of great cruelty. A lot of times, the biggest argument for sort of having a deterministic set of morals which are enforced through religion, like I said, heaven and hell, the will of a divine power, one of the biggest arguments for having something like Christianity, for having the Bible and the Ten Commandments, is that they don't change based on circumstances, which isn't exactly true either. Because even if you take killing, for example, thou shalt not kill, there are many instances in the Bible and within the history of Christendom in which killing was justified by the religious authorities. You take the Crusades, for example, killing was considered all right if it was in the service of the Crusades, which sought to retake the Holy Land from Islamic-occupied Israel, or at the time Jerusalem. In these instances, they decided killing was okay. So even within something like Christianity and Christian morals, they can be skewed or manipulated to support the interests of specific groups. But at the very least, they sort of provide certain acts which are considered good or bad, and which can essentially build the blocks which make up the morality of civilizations. Western civilization, at least, is highly influenced by Christian morality and Greek ethics. Even today, if you take someone who isn't religious, their morals are most likely based upon Christian morality and Greek ethics, which have existed within the continent of Europe for the past 2,000 years. Now, the reason I bring this up is because nowadays, and I think this phenomena, or at least this trend, started around the 1800s, more and more people are turning from religion. Therefore, the basis of the morality is also no longer ensured. Now, in the 1800s, you had the growth of nihilism, and you see philosophers like Nietzsche arise, who said, God is dead. Now, what he meant by that is that as people stop believing in God, as they stop having a foundation for their morality, they begin to sort of find themselves in a situation where life has no meaning, life has no purpose, which is essentially nihilism. If you don't believe in God, then you don't believe there's a foundation for your morality. There's nothing inherently good or bad. And essentially, you can do whatever you want because there's no point. Within Christianity, if you do good, you go to heaven. If you do evil, you go to hell. So there's a reason to do good or bad things. But within a nihilistic world without meaning, there's nothing stopping people from committing acts of great cruelty and doing horrible things, or living lives of hedonism, in which they simply try to pursue pleasure because it doesn't matter. If I'm going to die and nothing I do in life has any meaning, then why not try to enjoy as many things as possible? Or at least this is sort of the outcome of God dying, in Nietzsche's perspective at least. He talks about the last man. The last man is an individual who sort of just seeks pleasure, who constantly desires. And we talked about this a little bit in the last 10 minute philosophy. The idea of constantly being in the pursuit of desire, constantly wanting things, constantly wanting physical pleasure. This is the idea of the last man. And one of the reasons for this is because God is dead, according to Nietzsche. Without the belief of God, without the belief in a basis for morality, people can do whatever they want, and they're most likely going to pursue pleasure, because without meaning, the only thing you really know is whether you feel good or bad. So a lot of times people think Nietzsche is a critic of Christianity, which he certainly is to a certain degree, right? He calls Christians preachers of death. He says that Christians will go throughout life without trying to change anything because they believe that everything will be solved once they die. They'll receive eternal life regardless if their life was good on earth. Therefore, he believed Christian morality was weak because it allowed people to step over Christians and to sort of enforce the will upon them, because Christians might just allow it to happen with the belief that they would receive eternal life in heaven. Therefore, it didn't matter what they did in this world in terms of making this world a better place. As long as they followed the 10 Commandments, they attended their weekly mass, then they'd be good to go, right? So he called them preachers of death because within the Christian outlook, the good things would happen after you die. You have a whole eternity of happiness, so this life didn't really matter so much. And this also can be seen in existentialist philosophy, the works of Albert Camus or Jean-Jacques Sartre, for example, some of their criticisms of Christianity. But anyway, within the death of Christianity, so to say, the death of religion, God is dead. Like I said, starting in the 1800s and sort of leading into today, you start to lose the basis of right or wrong. Therefore, certain strong individuals, which Nietzsche would call the Ubermensch, are able to create their own values. Now, because strong people sort of fill the vacuum left behind by the loss of Christianity, they can manipulate morals and values to support their own gains. A lot of what Nietzsche wrote about with the will to power was adopted by the Nazis, for example. If there was no real right or wrong, then a strong individual could be the purveyor of all values which society should follow. And you saw that with the Nazis. With Hitler becoming the supreme leader of Germany, he essentially could say what was right or wrong, and despite certain individuals having specific moralities in the past, because Hitler sort of created his own values and told individuals what they should or shouldn't do, this led to ordinary people, ordinary men, eventually committing some of the greatest atrocities in world history. Now, Nietzsche's will to life can be interpreted in many different ways, so a lot of people will argue, and rightly so, that his beliefs were misconstrued by the Nazis. But nevertheless, the idea that there is no real foundation for morality allows people to commit great acts of evil. Now, there are sort of two types of evil that I want to discuss. One of them I just want to discuss briefly. It's the evil of the individual. Now, this can be due to genetics, it can be due to life experiences, or a combination of both. You have individuals who are more prone to psychopathy or sociopathy, for example. Naturally, they're going to be more prone to committing evil acts because their brains don't function like a normal individual does, and they may not feel empathy or remorse for committing evil acts. Some people with really bad life experiences can also sort of see these things happen to them. So through certain life experiences, you could develop antipathy towards people and might be more prone to committing violent, evil, cruel acts. This isn't really what I want to get into. I mean, it's certainly an interesting topic that I'll definitely go into in the future. Psychology is incredibly interesting. However, I really want to get into the evil of the group. The evil when a group comes together and decides things that are evil are now justified. And of course, I'm going to talk a lot about political movements of the past, such as the Nazis, the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution of China, Maoist China, and a few other examples as well. Now, the evil of the group. I really want to get into why people commit evil, and I think it's rooted, I think the evil committed by normal people within a collective group is rooted to it's rooted in the human evolutionary drive to be tribalistic. Humans are social creatures who find themselves in hierarchical structures based upon shared identity. This will start with the immediate family, for example. You have your significant other, your children, you'll do anything for them, and nobody's more important than them. And beyond that, you have clans, which are sort of your extended families, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles. Then you have tribes, which are generally a collection of clans, collection of families. And then eventually, over time, you have city-states, nation-states. And then today, we pretty much exist in nation-states, which essentially are countries with shared identity, generally, sometimes shared language, shared culture. But there's this idea that you're part of a country. This is who you are, especially in more mono-ethnic, monocultural societies. Take Japan, for example. There's this very strong idea of being Japanese, right? Which leads into one of my points I want to bring up. In multicultural countries, for example, without a predominant culture like the United States, people often start to identify themselves based upon an ideology or a subculture to fulfill their tribalistic tendencies. They might identify themselves based on their political beliefs, joining specific political parties, or their morality even. Like social movements are essentially an extension of a group of people's morality. Now, I want to really get into why a shared identity in collective groups can become incredibly dangerous. So, of course, we're talking about Nazi Germany, for example. I'm going to quote a few different, or not quote, but I'm going to bring up a few different points that were brought up in one of the Jocko Jordan Peterson podcasts, which talked a lot about evil. They bring up the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. I actually haven't read it, but I've read about it a little bit. And it's basically about this specific unit in World War II, this German unit, that they were basically military police within Poland. And it talked about how these were all just normal guys, normal people, but they would commit great acts of violence. And you don't really just have to look at this specific group, just look at all of Germany in general, especially when you get into the SS, for example. Obviously, the German Wehrmacht, which was the army, they were fighting a war. A lot of times they weren't as involved in the cruel acts that we hear about. But you take the SS, for example, in furthering the policies of the Holocaust, in being a part of death squads that would kill political rivals, that would kill partisans, which were rebels fighting against Nazi occupation. They would do incredibly horrible things to other people, incredibly cruel, evil acts. Now, most of them wouldn't do this as individuals. If you go back 20 years ago, before the Nazis took power, these people probably wouldn't have, if you had told those people that they would be committing mass genocide, they probably wouldn't believe you. But because of a collective group reframing what right or wrong was, they could tell you that committing these evil acts was actually a good thing. They could justify evil, cruel acts because if you have power, if you control power, you essentially control morality and you control what is right or wrong. When I talked about morality potentially being based upon the majority of people within a collective group, It also means people with power in the collective group. Obviously, the Nazis weren't, at least early on, didn't make up the majority of Germany, but they were able to attain power and eventually were able to manipulate morality to support their own goals and interests. And in doing so, they got ordinary people that were probably originally just good, ordinary people. Maybe not good, but certainly not bad, certainly not evil. But because they were able to create their own morality and their own values, they could get individuals to dehumanize members of different identities. In this case, people of Jewish ancestry, the Romani Gypsy people, and certain other demographics, the Slavs. They were able to dehumanize them, and all of the previous foundations of their morality, the previous rules of the morality, didn't apply anymore. You have to realize that most Germans in World War II, most of them were Christian. Obviously, there was a big sort of mystical movement behind the Waffen-SS, which promoted sort of pagan, a sort of neo-pagan revival. But most Germans in World War II, even if they weren't Christian, certainly based their morality on Christian values. So you see that when a social or political movement takes power and has the ability to change the values of a society, they're also able to convince normal, ordinary people to commit these mass acts of atrocity. Now, this also can be seen in the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. Peasant classes, the proletariat, the working classes have been so pissed off by the mistreatment at the hands of the Russian nobility for so long that when they finally had the power, they just massacred all the people that had been looking down on them for years. And you saw that in the French Revolution as well, the beheading of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. People, when they're really angry and they implant their anger on other people, they also dehumanize them. The same way that the Germans dehumanized the Jews and the Romani Gypsies and all these other people, the Bolsheviks, the French revolutionaries, dehumanized the nobility and massacred them. The Tsar, well, the previous Tsar of Russia, the head of the Romanov family, him and his family were dragged in the middle of the night, and he just watched his family get massacred in front of him. Just massacred. And these were people that were innocent. It was his children killed right in front of him. And that's what happens when people are so angry, or people come together as a collective and decide that certain things are no longer right or wrong, or they decide that things that are wrong generally are now justified. The Great Leap Forward is also a brilliant example of this. I don't know if any of you have ever read The Crucible. It's a book about witch hunts in the early colonial America, and it was about how different individuals would get back at different people by accusing them of witchcraft. So many people, if they didn't like someone, would say, that person, there's a witch, get rid of them. And you see this sort of similar witch hunt in The Great Leap Forward, in Maoist China, the Cultural Revolution. Certain people would accuse other individuals either out of fear or to further their own interests, and they would just get taken away and put in reindoctrination camps or just killed on the spot. A lot of times friends would turn on each other, family members would turn on each other, and you see these people who 30 years ago, before the Communist Revolution, probably would never have done these things, but because the collective group decided that new values should be put in place, a new morality should be put in place based on the interests of the collective, this sort of phenomenon, the outcome of this phenomenon was people doing completely horrible, evil things that they wouldn't have otherwise done if it wasn't justified by the collective group, by those in power within the collective group. Now, going forward, I also was watching the Lex Friedman podcast and his conversation with Ben Shapiro. One of the things that Ben Shapiro brought up was an example from Princeton professor Robert P. George. Apparently he had a thought experiment where he would ask his students if they were living in Alabama in like the 1850s or 1860s, essentially when they had slavery, would they be an abolitionist? And everyone in the class rose their hands. And he said, "You're all full of shit." And they are. Because ultimately speaking, most people support what is popular within the that time period. They support the popular movements of that time because people inherently will support what's popular. They will support the mainstream, regardless if it's right or wrong. So people that existed in that time frame would have thought slavery was completely okay because that was what most people believed in that area. And the same applies to all these other movements that we brought up. Nazi Germany, right? Most of the people at that time, as the Nazis rose in prominence and power, as the standard of living rose under the Nazis, people started to say, okay, well, I guess they're not so bad. And then their morality shifted to committing these acts of extreme evil atrocities. And this is a result of people, generally speaking, going with what's popular, going with the flow. The same applies today, right? Most people today that think they're doing good would probably think that in Nazi Germany they'd be fighting against the Nazis, that they'd be part of some resistance. They think they'd be abolitionists in the South during the time of slavery. They think they're doing the right thing, therefore they think that in the past they would have done the right thing. But it's not true. Most people, for better or worse, support what's popular, even if that thing is good. Let's say the popular movements of today are good, right? People are going to support them whether they're good or not. If they weren't good, they'd still be supporting them. All the people that are so fervently in the belief, but whether it be a social movement or a political movement or certain ideologies, especially in America today, they think that they're right. They think that they're good. They think that what they believe in is what's morally correct. But that's not the reason why they believe in it. They believe in it because it's popular, because it is, for the most part, what is accepted by the majority of society. Therefore, even if what they believed in was wrong, they'd still probably believe in it. And I don't really want to get into the specific movements today that I think are right or wrong. I simply want to say that the people that are following popular social movements are following them because they are supported by the majority of people in society, not necessarily because they're right or wrong. They could be right, but they could also be wrong. But regardless, the majority of people in society would support these popular movements. And who decides these popular movements? That could be a whole nother discussion that we could have hours talking about. But that's not really important, what I want to get into today. I mean, it's important, but I don't want to get into that today. But I do want to get into what makes people drawn to these movements, right? You have a lot of people talking about people nowadays being NPCs, kind of going through life. They're like, you're stuck in the matrix. And a lot of people will use these things incorrectly to further their own interests. You have, I've criticized them before, the red pill community. You have people be like, oh, you're living in the matrix, man, but the only way you can break out of the matrix is by making 6 figures, 7 figures a year. Get rich, And like, are you really escaping the matrix, or are you just benefiting from the matrix, right? It also goes into Nietzsche's description of the last man. The last man is someone that conforms to the popular movements, the popular direction, they're conformist to society. They don't try to go against the flow. They don't try to go against the grain. They don't question what's popular within society. They seek pleasure. They seek desire. They accept things as they are. They don't go against it. That's the last man. And that sort of, to me, describes an NPC. That describes the kind of person that would be a part of a popular movement, whether it was right or wrong, just because they're trying to conform to society. Now, I'm not saying it's always a bad thing. A lot of times, people coming together within a society is a good thing. You take World War II, for example. The American people banded together, regardless of the economic turmoil that was going on in the country. The Great Depression was still going on, even though it was improving a little bit. People came together and they decided, we're going to go overseas and we're going to go fight the enemies of our country. So popular movements aren't always a bad thing, but they can become bad very easily, and they're going to be supported by the people regardless of if they're right or wrong, regardless if they're good or bad, because people are drawn to supporting popular movements within a greater collective. Now, people will say, well, evil doesn't really exist nowadays. Even though we have a lot of disagreement in society, there's nothing too bad that's going on. People aren't that bad anymore. And I think this comes from individuals living within a bubble. A lot of us in America, in developed countries, in the middle class or upper middle classes, live in a bubble where we're not exposed to the reality of life. We're not exposed to the continued existence of evil. For a lot of people, they might think that evil doesn't exist in the world because they don't see it. That's far from the case. Even within the United States, if you go to areas of high crime, ghettos, there's still incredibly hard, it's still incredibly low standards of living where people are living in a constant state of crime, where their friends are getting shot every day. Not every day, okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Where their friends are getting shot, where people are getting shot every day. When they see friends die, when their parents are drug addicts, where they see drug dealers on every street corner, where they hardly have enough money to eat. This is the reality of a lot of people in the United States today that not all of us are exposed to because we live within our bubble, especially, like I said, within the middle and upper classes of society. Evil still exists in the world, in our own country, and even worse in other countries. Going back to the Jordan Peterson podcast, they were talking about the ISIS genocide of the Yazidi people. I don't even want to get into it here because of how horrible it is. If you want, just look up Jordan Peterson, Jocko talk about evil, ISIS, the Yazidi people, and they'll describe the sort of stories. There was a woman who wrote about her experience under ISIS occupation and the sort of things that happened to her and her people. The Yazidi people are horrible. And this isn't something that happened 50, 100 years ago. This isn't something that happened in World War II. This is something that happened years ago, a few years ago, and is still happening to a certain extent today. Many countries still exist in a constant state of war, a constant state of famine, a constant state of disease, and experience evil on a daily basis that we are not exposed to because we live in relative prosperity. And a lot of this evil that goes on throughout the world happens because of people coming together in collective groups and deciding something that's normally considered wrong is now considered right. You take ISIS, for example, that's religious fanaticism, right? They are, within Islam, they have rules which they should live by. But suddenly, if you take ISIS, they will manipulate the rules of their religion to justify genocide. And it's happened many times throughout many religions' history. Every single major organized religion has had history of violence. Even the Buddhists. Look what's happening in Myanmar and Burma. The Islamic minority in that country is being systematically eliminated by Buddhist individuals. We usually think of Buddhism as peaceful religion. Every single major organized religion that sort of believes in a divine power has had violent history. They've had moments of evil, which goes into the idea of innate morality, right? Even within these right or wrong, which is ingrained inherently within humans, you see the manipulation of the Bible, for example, to further people's interests. You see things like the 10 Commandments that say, "Thou shalt not kill," and yet people will kill in the name of their religion. And this is the issue when collective groups decide that morality can be manipulated to further their own specific interests. Now, I want to talk about how evil is rooted in hate, but also love, how evil can be rooted in power. Evil many times comes from hate, right? If someone hates another individual, they will do incredible acts of violence towards them and dehumanize them because they hate them, because they fail to see the humanity of them. Obviously, even if you take the most cold-blooded murderers, most of them would never do anything to their own family members because that's someone of their group, of their shared identity, and yet they'll go and just kill other individuals in cold blood. But then if you told them, like, what if this happened to your brother, your sister, your son? They would be distraught. They'd be like, I feel horrible if something like that happened to them. But then they would go and do it to someone else. So I'm getting at is when you hate someone, you don't see the humanity of them, and you're willing to do great acts of cruelty towards them. But a lot of times, hate can come from love, which is interesting, right? You take nationalism, for example. A lot of times, nationalism is supposed to be, and then we go into Camus saying, "I'm not a nationalist because I love my country," and that a person who truly loves their country wouldn't be a nationalist. So we can go into like all the semantics here, but let's just take a nationalist, for example. The idea of a nationalist is someone who loves their country, right? But a lot of times, this love for their country leads to evil committed to other countries. Evil coming from love. You love your family, and sometimes you'll do great things, great cruel things to other people in order to keep your family safe. And sometimes that's necessary, but it's out of love that you can hate someone. Because you love your family so much, you hate the enemy that's trying to kill your family. You hate the enemy that's trying to take the things that your family has, that's trying to make them unsafe. To make your family safe, you're willing to do evil things. Therefore, love comes from hate. Evil comes from hate. Evil comes from love. And that's just something I wanted to bring up because I think it's interesting that a lot of times really hateful, evil things, hate especially, is developed from love. Now, I know this has kind of been something that I've been bringing up constantly, but the collective power of society can lead to the normalization of evil, right? And then it kind of brings up the question then, well, how much should we allow collective groups to form, right? So like you take anarchists or libertarians, for example, who believe that, well, if each individual lives relatively unorganized, not too organized as a society, then nobody will be too powerful to infringe upon the rights of others. But inherently, collectives are inevitable. People will always come together to take power from other individuals. So if you don't belong to a collective, if you are an individual, for example, if you have a society of anarchists and you have one unified country, the one unified country will destroy the anarchists because collective groups are more powerful than individuals. Therefore, collectives are inevitable. And if you try to be an individual, you'll probably be absorbed and conquered by another. So it's sort of this dichotomy that collectives lead to evil oftentimes, but the only way to fight an evil collective is with your own collective. And if collectives sort of will become evil at some point, because that's what happens when people come together and they start to see other groups as different to them and as opposing. If they see their success opposed to another group's success, therefore to become more successful, to prosper more as a group, they have to defeat another group, then maybe inherently collectives will always lead to the manipulation of morality, the manipulation of values, and eventually evil acts being committed. But like I said, it's a dichotomy because collective groups are the only way that you can defeat other collective groups. So it's kind of inevitable. And it's also something that I think there's a sort of dichotomy of democracy that we see today. The only way to ensure free speech, for example, is a mainstay of democracy. But within free speech, you also have free speech of individuals who advocate for authoritarianism, for example. Technically speaking, within a democracy, if all the people, or at least the majority of people within a democracy, wanted to place a monarchy, then technically it would be within their right to do so, because a democracy is the will of the people, essentially, or it's supposed to be. So people could come together and vote in an authoritarian form of government. They could come in and vote in the establishment of a monarchy. And in doing so, that's the death of the democracy. But then if you end free speech and you say that individuals aren't able to come together and advocate for a monarchy or an autocracy, for example, then that is also the end of democracy, because you're no longer a democracy if you're stifling political opinions. So then it begs the question, is it possible to ensure is it impossible to secure the existence of a democracy? Is it impossible to stop collective groups from becoming evil, or to stop collective groups from forming? There's so many dichotomies when it comes to these things, which make talking about evil and how do we stop evil from happening so complex, right? Is evil inevitable because power is inevitable? Ultimately, people that are skilled, people that are able to control themselves and further their will upon others, that are able to manipulate others in order to become powerful, there will always be people like that. Within organizations, there will always be those within the organization that are in power. And there's no way to ensure that people who attain power will be good. In fact, it's most likely the opposite. Most of the time, power corrupts. But then again, power can only be defeated with power. Powerful groups can only be defeated by other powerful groups. Powerful people can only be defeated by other powerful people. And if power corrupts, if collective groups that come together become corrupted, then is evil inevitable in these groups? Is evil inevitable with those with power? And how do you change that, right? Another dichotomy that I like, if you've ever watched Fight Club, for example, it represents an individual wanting to break free from a consumer society. He lives in a monotonous life. The narrator, he goes to work, he comes home, he can't sleep. He's part of this sort of modern consumerist lifestyle, and he wants to escape. He is the last man initially, but then he rises to sort of become the Ubermensch. But in doing so, the narrator, who breaks free of consumer society, he breaks free, but then he enslaves other people, because the individuals who break free of the consumer society trade being a slave to consumer society to being a slave to this sort of social movement, which becomes Fight Club, which becomes Project Mayhem. So they're essentially sacrificing one freedom for another. They're liberating themselves one way to enslave themselves in another way. So then who is free? I know I'm going off today. I'm being a little bit all over the place with my little tangents, but then who is free? There's a great story, Diogenes the Cynic and Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, the most powerful person of his time, was walking down the streets, maybe Corinth, I can't remember exactly. And Diogenes was this philosopher, brilliant, smart man, very Dionysian, I guess. I don't know if maybe Dionysian is not the right word, but he's a vagabond. He was homeless. He lived in a bathtub, and he went on the streets all day and tried to be as obnoxious as possible. He'd walk around naked. He'd try to make people uncomfortable. A lot like the Tyler Durden, actually, which is why I'm bringing him up. And Alexander the Great admired him for being a truly free man, because he answered to nobody. Diogenes answered to nobody. The famous story goes that Alexander walked up to Diogenes and looked at him and said, "Diogenes, ask of me anything, and if it's in my power, I'll give it to you." And Diogenes says, "There's something you could do for me. Move aside, the sun. You're blocking the sun." He was sun tanning. And Alexander laughs and says, if I could be anyone else but Alexander, I would be Diogenes. To which Diogenes was surprised, if I could be anyone but Diogenes, I'd also want to be Diogenes. So he's just this very free guy. So it goes into who is free, right? Alexander answered to nobody, kind of. He was at the top rung of society, but then he had to answer to his constituents. He had to appease different generals, different statesmen, right? Maybe Diogenes was a truly free person because he answered to nobody and he didn't care about anything. No morals or values stopped him from acting however he wanted. So which is interesting. Freedom. What is freedom? There's a brilliant poem that I want to read to you guys by Charles Bukowski. He's a well-known nihilist, a student of Nietzsche, and a famous writer, and a lot of people say he's the perfect example of an Ubermensch, someone who creates their own values, who goes against the tide of humanity, and who creates dangerously. Albert Camus talks about the idea of creating dangerously, creating art that might piss people off, that doesn't necessarily satisfy people. That, like, you take a lot of artists who originally create raw music, but then they become mainstream to satisfy more people, to get more of an audience, to make more money. The Ubermensch, someone who creates dangerously, who doesn't care, who creates art for the sake of art, not to make money, not to become famous. And this poem is called The Genius of the Crowd by Charles Bukowski, and I think it illustrates the idea of danger of a collective group. There is enough treachery, hatred, violence, absurdity in the average human being to supply any given army on any given day. And the best at murder are those who preach against it. And the best at hate are those who preach love. And the best at war, finally, are those who preach peace. Those who preach God need God. Those who preach peace do not have peace. Those who preach peace do not have love. Beware the preachers. Beware the knowers. Beware those who are always reading books. Beware those who either detest poverty or are proud of it. Beware those quick to praise, for they need praise in return. Beware those who are quick to censor. They are afraid of what they do not know. Beware those who seek constant crowds, for they are nothing alone. Beware the average man, the average woman. Beware their love. Their love is average, seeks average. There is a genius in their hatred. There is enough genius in their hatred to kill you, to kill anybody. Not wanting solitude, not understanding solitude. They will attempt to destroy anything that differs from their own. Not being able to create art, they will not understand art. They will consider their failure as creators only as a failure of the world. Not being able to love fully, they will believe your love incomplete. And they will hate you, and their hatred will be perfect. Like a shining diamond, like a knife, like a mountain, like a tiger, like hemlock. Their finest art. I love that poem so much, and I love Charles Bukowski's poems in general. I'll definitely go more in depth into that poem later on. But that sort of gives us this bleak thing. He's like, it's like, fuck. The majority is always going to be like, the majority could be wrong, the majority could be evil. Beware of the crowd, beware of the majority. But as we described, majorities, collectives, groups are inevitable. So what's left to do? I think my interpretation comes from Fight Club as well. They talk about the idea that there is hope, and the hope is that there is no hope. Hope is the root of great anxiety. No hope is true liberation. I think what that means to me is you do your best, and only your best, and whatever happens, happens. You do what you can to control. You do what you can in regards to the things that you can control, but ultimately there are outside forces that you cannot control, and that is fate, and that happens. And knowing that you can't control that, knowing that there is no hope, that there's nothing you can do if something bad happens, is true freedom. And that's truly being separate from anxiety. That's true liberation. And to finish this off, I want to go briefly into The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, who is an existentialist, absurdist philosopher, also a student of Nietzsche. The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a Greek king who lived a long time, and eventually Hades, the god of death, came up to chain him and bring him to the underworld. And Hades said, "It's time to go." And Sisyphus, a very crafty man, cunning man, said, "Those chains you have, how do you know they work?" And Hades is like, "I don't know." So he says, "Why don't you try them on yourself first? Put them around yourself to see if they fit." And so he does. And he puts his chains around him, and he says, "Oh, they work. Can you let me out now so I can take you to the underworld?" And Sisyphus laughs and pushes him into a closet. Goes on living. Now the gods, after a few days, realize no one's dying. People are getting their heads chopped off in battle and grabbing their heads, putting it back on. People are getting run over, dying, and then coming back to life because, Hades can't take them to the underworld. So death is ended, and they figure out what's happened. They find Hades, and they find out what happened, and Sisyphus is fucked. They take Sisyphus to the underworld, and they subject him to the worst punishment possible. Pushing a boulder up a hill, only for it to fall down as soon as it reaches the top. Sisyphus is constantly in a state of struggle and suffering. He pushes the boulder up the hill only for it to fall down, and there's nothing he can do about it. Now, Albert Camus says this is an analogy for our life. And not to pity Sisyphus, but to be inspired by him. That we must think Sisyphus as happy as he pushes the boulder up the hill. At every moment he's suffering. But the greatest way that we can rebel against a lack of meaning in our lives is to be happy nonetheless. Despite the fact that there is no hope, we are still free of anxiety, and we let things happen as they happen. We do not, as Epictetus says, we should not be afraid of the things that are outside of our control, and we should not feel anxiety for the things that are outside of our control. Now, obviously, we can go into different interpretations of everything we're talking about. I provide these philosophies. I try to get some things out of them, but they're not the tell-all be-alls. You shouldn't take everything I say literally. Take it with a grain of salt. As many of you know, I am Christian. I follow Christian doctrine, but I still find all these philosophies that definitely wouldn't traditionally go along with Christian doctrine. I find them incredibly inspiring and incredibly interesting, and I think there's ways that you can take from that and build upon your own beliefs that you have now. I definitely fashion myself a Christian in the way that Kierkegaard was a Christian. I took a leap of faith. I don't look for proof when it comes to religion. I just choose to believe because I think that's a good way to live your life is Christian ethics, Christian morality. So I took a leap of faith, like Kierkegaard said. But anyway, Ubermensch. Create dangerously. Do not be the last man. Do not allow society to go on creating mindless, unthinking beings. Go against the tide and create dangerously for the sake of art and not to satisfy the majority. Don't sell your soul to the devil. Like, that's not a literal thing. Even Christians don't believe you can sell your soul to the devil. But, like, if I say sell your soul to the devil, I mean that. Creating art to satisfy the majority. Doing things for others. And it's good to do things for others. Don't get me wrong. Like, helping people is good. But if you do things because you want the admiration of others, if you do things because you want to, you want to satisfy the majority. And I don't mean satisfy, like, go out and help people, 100%. I think that's the greatest thing you could do is help others. But people that create art to appeal to the majority of people, that's selling your soul. And I hate that. Stay authentic. Be true. All of us are going to be hypocrites to a certain extent. I'm a hypocrite in many aspects of my life for sure. You guys all are. But the most we can do is try our best to go against that. Go against the grain. Create dangerously and try our best to live the most authentic life possible. And we do that through reading about different philosophies, through listening to different viewpoints, and just constantly growing. Seek perfection, knowing you will never be perfect. And that's something I'm passionate about. I am far from perfect, but I'm trying my best. And it's very hard sometimes. I'm falling short every day, but I'm also doing great things every day. And it's a combination. Like, it took me so long to make this video because I kept, the first few minutes, I kept hating the way it was going. So eventually I figured, fuck it, I'm just going to make it. And this was very unorganized, way past 10 minutes like last time, but so be it. I'm passionate about this, and I'll definitely do another video on the nature of evil in the future. Maybe we'll go more into the specific individual evils that people can commit, but I think this was a nice talk by myself to you guys, and I hope you enjoyed it. I don't got anything else to say right now. Been reading a lot of Nietzsche recently, very fascinated with him, so there'll be a lot more videos on Nietzsche in the future. I'm hoping to do a podcast tomorrow. We'll see. I think one of my friends is willing to join, actually Austin, who does some of the edits on here. We'll see, because Brandon's currently in Maryland. But anyway, yeah, thanks for watching. If you watched this far, you're an OG. You're awesome. But yeah, I don't know what else to say for now, but Gimli was mad at me for making the video. He's sad now. He's sleeping because he went to play. Things I do for you guys, Anyway, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. I'll see you next time.